Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we are going to talk about the transgender debate, the gender identity debate. We're going to pick up where I left off with a previous mini-documentary investigative report that I did in 2023 called Identity Crisis. This was actually a 4-part article series written for The Last American Vagabond, and it turned into about an hour and 15-minute podcast, documentary, whatever you want to call it. And I brought up a lot of different issues there, including one of them was at the time was the interim report, which is known as the Cass report, coming from the British NHS. And there is now an update on it. The final report, the final edition of the Cass report has been released, and it's even more telling, and we need to get this information in front of as many people as possible. I will preface this by saying the same thing I said with Identity Crisis, is that my goal here is not to divide, to attack anybody for their particular beliefs or whatever they want to identify as, things of that sort, just to create more division in general. My goal, though, is to say, if we're going to talk about complex and difficult issues like gender identity, we should be able to deal with the facts. On one hand, we should say that, yes, it's okay, and I think should be encouraged to question gender roles and, to let women be whatever kind of woman they want to be. And if that means a quote-unquote traditional woman cooking food and being, the caretaker, the home taker, and the man going out and making money, and that fits them, so be it. But if a woman wants to do the opposite, or stay single or not get married or not have kids, then great for that too. I agree we should challenge and question gender roles, generally speaking, but there's also science and data behind things like puberty suppressing hormones, of course, gender surgeries that are taking place, and not to mention the impact that this is having on children and young adults via social media like TikTok. So it's highly important that we get the story right and that we understand the facts. So that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about and discuss and dissect the facts. Before we go any further, I want to remind you guys about my website, theconsciousresistance.com. First off, right away, I would encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter. You'll see it pop up when you visit the site. This is where you can get all of my recent content, interviews, podcasts, not only mine, but from our other contributors, Anthony Samaroff, Don Villa, writing articles. You can see my trip to the pyramids last week at the solar eclipse, some really important articles and interviews we've had coming up. Find our investigations, find our documentaries, look at my books, look at our various categories we have on the website to get deeper into our investigations, because we've been doing this for 11 years now. So check it all out there at theconsciousresistance.com. Now let's go ahead. I want to show you this. This will, of course, I will link everything in the show notes. This is Identity Crisis. We released it September 2023, an investigation of the gender identity debate. And as I said, I think this one comes out to about an hour and 20 minutes. It's well worth your time. And the sources of this are the 4-part series I did for The Last American Vagabond. I'll just read you guys the titles real quick. The first one was called Gender Identity History, Puberty Blockers, and Hormones. The second one was called Gender, quote-unquote, Gender Affirming Surgery, Social Contagion, Detransitioners, and the Autism Overlap. And the third one was Shifting Government Policies. And the fourth one, finally, The Network Behind Gender Identity Ideology. Now, we're going to deal with the third part of this series, which was about shifting government policies. And this was just me writing and acknowledging that in Europe specifically, but in the UK and a few other countries, including the Netherlands, that there are now policies kind of going in reverse. Finland and other countries, after years of embracing surgeries and hormones and things, and having much more experience, and Sweden, another place, having much more experience than the United States, are now starting to reverse their whole policies and everything they were doing. And so in the Identity Crisis investigation and in the documentary, the video series, I talked about the Cass report. And here I wrote, by September 2020, an independent review led by Dr. Hilary Cass also called for a fundamentally different model of care for children with gender dysphoria. Cass is a pediatrician and former president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. The interim report of the Cass review was published in March 2022, so 2 years ago. It said that the rise in referrals had led to the staff being overwhelmed and recommended the creation of a network of regional hubs to provide care and support to young people. The report noted that the clinical approach used by GIDS had, quote, not been subjected to some of the usual control measures typically applied with new treatments, and raised concerns about the lack of data collection by the GIDS. And also along with this development, the Tavistock Clinic, which was really greatly involved in promoting this whole thing, they are alleged to, or supposed to have closed by March 2024. I haven't checked up on this in a while. Maybe you guys over there can update me. Is Tavistock still open? It's supposed to be shut down now for a couple of years. So that's what I wrote about before. Now, here we are. Let's get into first a couple of more recent updates before we get to the CAS report. This one, even CNN is having to admit England's health service to stop prescribing puberty blockers to transgender kids. This was published a couple of weeks ago, mid-March. England's National Health Service has stopped prescribing puberty blockers for children and young people with gender dysphoria or gender incongruence, saying there's, quote, not enough evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty-suppressing hormones, sometimes known as PSHs. And this decision, which was widely condemned by LGBT groups, they said they made this after carefully considering the evidence, and they put this in a policy document, which you can find right here. NHS published March 12, 2024, puberty-suppressing hormones for children and younger people who have gender incongruence, gender dysphoria. Let's get down here to sort of the crux of the statement. Right here, what we have decided, NHS England has carefully considered the evidence. We have concluded there is not enough evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty-suppressing hormones to make the treatment routinely available at this time, which was what they had been doing, is allowing doctors to just sort of give these treatments out. I don't want to say with no restrictions, because I did look into this in the documentary, and I wouldn't say it's like that in every case like some conservatives say, but absolutely there have been some doctors in some places that are absolutely engaged in almost a sort of activist nature of like promoting this, like, because there is an ideology, there is a movement behind this, and some people have bought into it and they've let go of the actual science and the data. Thankfully, though, here the NHS, as of last month, saying there are not enough evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty-suppressing hormones and to make this routinely available at the time. So pretty big news right there. Now this, I was reading this really interesting article, and I'm going to read more of it to you. Britain is leaving the U.S. gender medicine debate behind. First, I want to address that this came from The Atlantic. You know, I read everything. I read mainstream, I read corporate media, I look into it all, and I do so for numerous reasons, because I like to challenge myself and read things that are going to have opinions that I don't think I'm going to agree with. And sometimes that's the case, and I'm like, these people are wrong, but at least I know what the quote-unquote other side's saying. Or I gain new knowledge, new information, and I actually do learn, and that's always fun. But I think The Atlantic is one of these places that can be good on some issues and really horrible on others, COVID being the others, many others. And I think that this issue, though, there are some writers The Atlantic is actually allowing to talk common sense and just basic truth relating to gender identity, transgender issues. And so this article, it's all about the CAS report, the final review, which we're going to go over in a second. But I just want to read the first few paragraphs because it does a really great job of outlining the situation. Again, titled, Britain is leaving the U.S. gender medicine debate behind. The CAS report challenges the scientific basis of medical transition for minors. And this right here is Hilary Cass, for those who are looking on screen. Sort of middle-aged British lady, doctor. Says, in a world without partisan politics, the CAS report on youth gender medicine would prompt serious reflection from American trans rights activists, their supporters in the media, and doctors and institutions offering hormonal and surgical treatments to minors. At the request of the English National Health Service, the senior pediatrician Hilary Cass has completed the most thorough consideration yet of this field, and her report calmly and carefully demolishes many common activist tropes. Puberty blockers do have side effects, she found. The evidence base for widely used treatments is shaky. Their safety and effectiveness are not settled science. This report drew on extensive interviews with doctors, parents, and young people, as well as on a series of new systematic literature reviews. Its publication marks a decisive turn away from the affirmative model of treatment, in line with similar moves in other European countries. What Cass's final document finds largely is an absence. Quote, the reality is that we have no good evidence on the long-term outcomes of intervention to manage gender-related distress. Cass writes, they also say we don't have strong evidence that social transitioning, such as changing names or pronouns, affects adolescents' mental health outcomes, either positively or negatively. And I will say, when I was doing my research for the gender identity documentary, there was definitely some feeling and some discussion among some folks that by affirming, by doing the name change and stuff, you actually start to affirm what might be a mental illness for some people, and that could sort of further along by participating in it. But yeah, I would say the evidence is, there's a lack of evidence in a lot of areas, and there's negative evidence in many areas. We don't have strong evidence that puberty blockers are merely a pause button, or that their benefits outweigh their downsides, or that they are life-saving care in the sense that they prevent suicides. We don't know why the number of children turning up at gender clinics rose dramatically during the 2010s. I have some ideas, I'm sure you guys too. Or why the demographics of those children changed from a majority of biological males to a majority of biological females. Neither Born That Way nor It's All Social Contagion captures the complexity of the picture. And that's what I've talked about, social contagion. I do think there's an element of social contagion, though, that is true via TikTok and other platforms and mainstream corporate media pushing it for the last decade, as they talk about in here, that in 2014, Time Magazine declared the transgender fight the next big civil rights battle. You know, they've been putting it in media for a while and putting it in people's heads, so I do think there's social contagion. But here's what the CAS report confidently says. When it comes to alleviating gender-related distress, quote, for the majority of young people, a medical pathway may not be the best way to achieve this. That conclusion will now inform the creation of new state-provided services in England. These will attempt to consider patients more holistically, acknowledging that their gender distress might be part of a picture, and I think this is important because it's complex, that also includes anxiety, autism, obsessive-compulsive disorder, eating disorders, or past trauma. This is a million miles away from prominent American medical groups' recommendation to simply affirm an adolescent state of gender. And this is, again, this is what is going on in America. While other countries are studying the data because they've had time, the American groups are just like, nah, keep going forward, keep embracing it. A Reuters investigation found that 18 U.S. clinics surveyed, none of them conducted lengthy psychological assessments used by Dutch researchers who pioneered the use of these gender treatments and who have also since started to reverse their policies. Some clinics prescribe puberty blockers or hormones during a patient's first visit. This is the United States. Under pressure from its members, the American Academy of Pediatrics last year commissioned its own review, which is still allegedly in progress. The CAS report findings also contradict the prevailing wisdom at many media outlets. And I think this is important. This is why I like this Atlantic article, because it's calling out the fact that it isn't just that there's been some American medical agencies promoting this idea, but that the alleged journalists and the corporate deadstream media, that these stenographers, they are also responsible for pushing it, and so are politicians. And these people are now so deeply invested that you know, they don't want to let go, and they don't want to admit that they were wrong. It finds that recent extreme example. So it talks about how like many of the media outlets repeated the advocacy trans groups' talking points uncritically. And it says, in an extreme example, recently noted by writer Jesse Singal, CNN seems to have a verbal formula repeated across multiple stories to assure its audience that gender-affirming care is medically necessary, evidence-based care. And on a variety of platforms, prominent liberal commenters have presented growing concerns about the use of puberty blockers as a, quote, ill-informed moral panic. So they're basically saying, like, the detransitioners and the people who are speaking out are being dismissed as right-wingers or transphobic and things like this. And here's Jesse Singal over at Substack. Why is the same misleading language about youth gender medicine copy and pasted into dozens of CNN articles? And I thought this was interesting. He did this a couple weeks ago, and this is what the Atlantic is referring to. He found this sentence that, quote, gender-affirming care is medically necessary, evidence-based care that uses a multidisciplinary approach to help a person transition from their assigned gender to their affirmed gender. And then he searches this medically necessary evidence-based care and finds like so many different examples of it. And you can go through here and they find at least, they list 30 different articles. Yeah, there's like 30 of them in here, 35 articles that have that same language, medically recognized, evidence-based, medically necessary, evidence-based care, some version of that. And so you can see that there's a script that's being given out across the corporate media. Now, back to the CAS report. The truth is that although American medical groups have indeed reached a consensus about the benefits, the alleged benefits of youth gender medicine, doctors with direct experience in the field are divided, particularly outside the U.S. The CAS report writes, clinicians who have spent many years working in gender clinics have drawn very different conclusions from their clinical experience about the best way to support young people with gender-related distress. CAS writes, her report is a challenge to the latest standards of care from the U.S.-based World Professional Association for Transgender Health, also known as WPATH. So this is what you got to think. This organization calls itself the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, but it's based in the U.S. It's a U.S.-based organization. As we just discussed, doctors and media in the U.S. are heavily pushing this. But WPATH says that they have declined to institute minimum age limits for surgery. So people look to this organization in the trans community for data about what's safe and what's the latest science and this and that. And the WPATH is continuing to just ignore reality. They go here, the literature review included with her report is notably brutal about these guidelines, which are highly influential in youth, gender, and medicine in America around the world, but which, according to Cass, lack developmental rigor. So she's saying that, like, these gender clinics have drawn very different conclusions from the clinical experience about the best way versus the clinicians. And so this is what I was saying, and as I did in my documentary, and I encourage you to go back and read the identity crisis articles or watch the documentary, the report, to look at the network behind promoting, the people who are funding and promoting these doctors, these colleges, universities, etc. So the crux of the report is that the ambitions of youth gender medicines outstrip the evidence, or as Cass put it, that doctors at the UK clinic whose practices she was examining, although they may be well-meaning, quote, developed a fundamentally different philosophy and approach compared to other pediatric and mental health services. She asks, how did the medical pathway of puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, a treatment based on a single Dutch study from the 90s, spread around the world so quickly and decisively? Why didn't clinicians seek out more studies to confirm or disprove its safety and utility earlier? And what should child gender services look like now? Now, I'm almost done reading this article. I just want to show one other part of this. The answer to the first two questions is the same. Medicalized gender treatments for minors became wrapped up with a push for a wider social acceptance of transgender people, something that was presented as the next frontier in civil rights, as Time magazine once described it. And that's what I was talking about. It was when it had the actor from the Orange is the New Black, and they were like the first big transgender person making all this waves, and they were on the front of Time magazine. Any questions about such care were therefore read as stemming from transphobic hostility, full stop. And when those questions kept coming anyway, right-wing politicians and anti-woke comedians piled on, sensing an area where left-wing intellectuals were out of touch with popular opinion. In turn, that allowed misgivings to be dismissed as fascism, even though, as the British journalist Sarah Didham has written, it is not damning of feminists that they are on the same page as Vladimir Putin about there being two sexes. That is just how many sexes there are. So they're basically saying there has been this push in the media and doctors, clinics, but there is some sense coming now with this new final report. I'm going to link all this, the final report of the Cass from Dr. Hilary Cass, submitted final report and recommendations to NHS England, and in her role as chair of the Independent Review of Gender Identity Services for Children and Young People. So this report makes it known about what young people who are seeking NHS support around gender identity, and sets out recommended clinical approaches to care and support they should expect, and makes it clear that they can't get hormones and things of that sort. It also makes recommendations on the quality improvement and research infrastructure required to ensure that the evidence-based underpinning care is strengthened. She said that she relied on currently available evidence and thinks about how the NHS can respond safely, effectively, and compassionately, while also still leaving some wider, bigger issues up for social debate, which I think is just kind of an admission that they're not going to solve every single problem. They know that there's a lot of debate in society around puberty blockers, around transgender care, but that they're really trying to stick to the science. And obviously that's what we want. I mean, this is what this whole thing is about. This is why I'm taking time to do this report, because I do think that people are emotional on all sides of this discussion. You have people who try to say that if you even question the safety of hormones and surgeries and things of this sort, you must be transphobic, white nationalists. And then people who maybe do really foster some sort of anger or dislike for gay people, non-traditional people, whatever you want to say, and would like to see laws going after these folks. That's not something that I individually, personally support, but it is a complex situation. Nevertheless, they go through here. Here's some of the key findings. It says there's no simple explanation for the increase in numbers of predominantly young people and adults who have trans or gender diverse identity, but there is broad agreement that it is a result of complex interplay between biological, psychological, and social factors. There are often conflicting views about the clinical approach, with exceptions of care at times being far from usual practice. This has made some clinicians fearful of working with gender questioning young people, despite their presentation being similar to many children and young people presenting to other NHS services. They say that the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence based on the care of children and young people are often misrepresented and overstated both in scientific publications and in social debate. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier. They go on to say the rationale for early puberty suppression remains unclear, with weak evidence regarding the impact on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health. The effect on cognitive and psychosexual development remains unknown. So, yeah, that's something we've been discussing. That also says the use of masculinizing, feminizing hormones in those under the age of 18 also presents many unknowns, despite their long-standing use in the adult transgender population. The lack of long-term follow-up data on those commencing treatment at an early age means we have inadequate information about the range of outcomes for this group. And it says clinicians are unable to determine with any certainty which children and young people will go on to have an enduring trans identity. And of course, they go into some of the recommendations, which I've already sort of gone over and touched on. And I want you guys to look at this. I'm going to include the actual link to the final report. You can see it on your own. The CAS review, the final report of the CAS review just published this month, or just this past month here in March. And it's big news. I think this is important information that people need to be paying attention to. And I just want to say for a moment that the reason I bring these topics to the table and discuss them is because, as I said a moment ago, I think there's too much emotion and too much arguments on each side and not enough facts and looking at what is actually happening, looking at the actual data. So I don't discuss this because I want to add to some culture war, hatred of people who are different, or because I want to just cause division in some way. I do it because there are children and young adults in our crazy, crazy world who are more confused than ever and who are looking for something, looking for community, looking for connection. And some of them will find this via TikTok and other places where ideas start being presented to them, like maybe you're non-binary, maybe you're not the body you were born in or the identity you were born to. And, nothing wrong to those who are adults and identify as such, but there's absolutely something wrong about targeting children and getting them to think about these questions at an early age. And then not only that, we're finding out, as we are finding out in these different reports, that the treatment is not even based on actual hard evidence and science and data. And in fact, the hormones are being pushed on the kids at a young age in the U.S. Surgeries are being considered without much care to the future. Detransitioners are being ignored, and people who are critical are being attacked and labeled. This is not a good place to be in terms of truth, in terms of trying to actually create a successful society of free people, and especially when it comes to protecting the younger ones. We need to give them a space where they can pursue their creativity and their teenage years, their young adult years, with all the openness they need to. Because I'm all for questioning norms and traditions and things like that, but they need to do so in a space where they're not being there's not predators out there trying to convince them of things that are unscientific. Now, the last story I wanted to cover is this world's leading authority on gender-affirming care revealed to be unscientific and ethical. We just talked about WPATH a moment ago. This is coming from the Counter Signal. Leaked files indicate that the members of WPATH often engage in improvised treatments without meeting the rigorous standards expected in medical care. It says, leaked files from WPATH have exposed significant ethical concerns within the so-called medical practice known as gender-affirming care. Made public by Environmental Progress, the leaked documents reveal a pattern of ethical violations and a lack of adherence to evidence-based medical practices by clinicians. WPATH, a prominent authority in gender medicine, has massive influence on global standards in transgender healthcare, as we've been discussing already. Journalist Michael Schellenberger with Environmental Progress says the WPATH files show that what is called gender medicine is neither science nor medicine. The experiments are not randomized, double-blind, or controlled. It's not medicine, since the first rule is to do no harm, and that requires informed consent. And they go on to just show in these different leaked files that in conversations, both text conversations and apparently video recording calls, that officials within WPATH acknowledge that there are those who are going to have regret. And if you've noticed anything about this discussion, it is that the people who are defensive or defending the transgender community, they will act like there is no detransitioners. Those are just a right-wing talking point. And they downplay that. They really downplay this. So let's get into this. It says the leaked files indicate that members of WPATH often engage in improvised treatment without meeting the rigorous standards expected in medical care. Particularly alarming is the revelation that children and adolescents undergoing gender-affirming care may not fully comprehend the lifelong implications of such treatments. One leaked video clip showed one WPATH panel member acknowledging that many young adults who receive so-called gender-affirming care later experience reproductive regret. Quote, like regret, it's there, and I don't think that surprises many of us. And it goes on from there. So this is WPATH, again, the organization in the United States that's seen as like the leading authority that is all about pushing this. Meanwhile, as we're seeing in this report, starting with the Atlantic, the CAS report, the final report is now rethinking everything from puberty blockers to the approach of surgeries. You can go back to March, where NHS announced that they were going to stop prescribing puberty blockers to transgender kids. It is happening in places outside the United States. Unfortunately, the United States is still being led and influenced by WPATH, by the Pritzker family, and by some of the people that I identified in my 4-part article series, Identity Crisis, where you can go to The Last American Vagabond, you can look at my author page, and you can see my whole series of articles. You can also go watch the hour-long investigation at theconsciousresistance.com, Identity Crisis. And so we're going to wrap up now. I just want to say, like, the reason I'm doing this again is to give you, if this is a topic that you care about, and if you care about the younger generations that are getting lost in the mix of this, is to give you some ammo, some actual data, not emotional talking points, but to say, like, look, here's another agency in England, medical agency, that is now reversing policy on puberty blockers and hormones and on surgeries, and use this to have healthy discussions. I get that some people aren't going to listen to you and they're just going to dismiss you and call you racist or bigoted or whatever, but for those of us who are still trying to hold on to grasp of reality and talk with adults about complex issues, this is one more piece of evidence that you can use in your discussions, and it's important to use this because the information's out there. So that's why I'm doing it. I'm bringing it to you in hopes of giving you some tools to have more of a rational, healthy discussion with the people around you. I know that's not always easy, but we have to stick to the truth. We got to decipher through the lies, and that's what I'm here to do. That's why I do my work. So I want to remind you guys, the website is theconsciousresistance.com. Please visit at least once a week. Sign up at theconsciousresistance.com/invest on Substack, or buy me a coffee, or donate via crypto, or you can send stuff in the mail. If you want to support, buy shirts from us, buy books. That's the best way to support us. And I will continue to do this work and diving into these complex topics. So thank you guys so much for listening. As always, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful.